what I've been saying to young people a lot lately is to like learn about money, and not just like good old fashioned financial literacy, right? We need, as change makers, we need to understand how capital is flowing through our communities. And I took some finance classes in college and resented that because I was like, oh, I'm not into that. I want to help people. But the truth is, that's where the power is. So those of us who have a racial justice analysis, if we can understand how money is moving through communities, every campaign that we care about, whether it's immigration reform, whether it's affordable housing, whatever it is, it all boils down to money and who is benefiting financially from these different issues. So we need to understand. I'm like, go get your MBA. And understand. I wish I understood the stock market more than I do now, or impact investing in those things. I don't have a super sophisticated understanding. I'm learning, but that's where I think young people can really be super helpful to get into those spaces. We have foundations, for example, that are committing 100% of their assets for mission-related investments, but they can't find wealth managers and people who work in that space who have an analysis about race to actually do the work. So that's the challenge. The last thing I'll say to your point about people of color, there is a two-legged table or stool or whatever that is upholding white supremacy. One is this idea of white superiority and white dominance and oppression, but there's also internalized oppression. That often people of color can internalize from the trauma and perpetuate the system in ways that sometimes can be worse than white people. And so it's incumbent on all of us to have an analysis and understanding about racial oppression and white dominance and all those things, and to fight back. And we often, especially people of color, focus over here on what needs to be changed, but we also have a lot of work to do in our own communities to decolonize our thinking and to reject some of these notions and to hold ourselves accountable to the appropriate analysis. So. Right. I'm so glad you brought up DAFs because, yes, yeah, Fidelity Charitable is the largest, holds more charitable assets than any foundation. I do think that the old school type of foundations as we have now are kind of an old vehicle. We're not going to see any more Ford foundations starting up. So those of us who care about equity in this space have to understand and watch what's happening. And so donor advised funds are super problematic in a lot of ways, right? Because they don't even have the 5% payout rule. So I started a donor advised fund at Fidelity because I wanted to see what this was all about, right? I went undercover. Not a lot of money, right? But I was like, let me see what they do because I'm just curious if I'm going to talk about this. So I put a little bit of money there, and I routinely get emails asking me to make more contributions. Don't forget, end of the year, right? And never have I received an email encouraging me to give, right? Because obviously you don't have to. And so wealth managers and folks are increasingly advising wealthy folks to put their money there without, right? This is money that has escaped taxation, money that would have gone into the safety net, public education, all of those things that we need. And so I feel like there's going to have to be some type of legislation to shut this down, right? So we as individuals are putting aside your institutional hat. It doesn't matter where you work. We as people who live in this country and care about public services and goods need to know what's going on in that space. And so I'm hoping that there's some type of legislation that comes forward in the future that puts some types of limitations or restrictions or mandates on donor advised funds. There are folks like Amalgamated Bank in New York City that's trying to offer packages and things that are comparable, that actually do pay out and encourage people to take the high road or whatever. But those are the progressive folks that are going there to start their DAFs, right? The majority of folks are not plugged in to conversations like this and are putting their wealth there to be hoarded and used by these banks. So I'm super alarmed by what I see and hear coming from that space. And I think that we need to start strategizing in spaces like this. Is there something we can do to call attention to that? I do think that because of what's happening in DC right now and I don't know if, of course, you guys are watching and listening, where safety net budgets, Medicaid, and all this is just continuing to be slashed. At some point in the future, I think that folks in DC are going to look at foundations and this $800 billion, and they're going to look at donor advised funds, and they're going to come for that money. So we better get it together on our side to start using this money in ways that is actually helping. Or somebody in DC may figure that out before us, and either way, I hope that it happens. But yeah, donor advised funds are super problematic, and I don't know, I don't have a solution other than I think legislation is going to be required to change it. I have. Yeah, I'm shocked, honestly, Gary. I'm shocked at the notes I'm receiving from like so many foundations. Their whole entire boards are reading the book, whether they're talking to me or not. They're like, we're reading this book. And I'm like, wow, I want to know what y'all think about it when you're done. From foundations that we would all recognize, and some are known to be more progressive than others. So people are reading the book. I have met with boards and had conversations with sort of the gamut, like some more conservative leaning. Family foundations are very interesting, right? It's a very different beast of folks who they feel like it is really their money, right? Tech funders are also interesting because they are like, will we earn this money? We didn't earn this money from slavery, so, right? So I will say that I feel, I've really have felt hopeful. I've been invited into these spaces, also some major corporations that I'm speaking to, and financial institutions who I don't know why they're inviting me in, but I go. It makes me want to believe that folks want to understand what this conversation is. And maybe feel compelled by what's happening in this country, that we got to do something different. A lot of folks have been really open, and honest about their journey and wanting to learn. There's a lot of white guilt out there, right? And I'll take some good old white guilt and teach them and get the resources. You can work with that a little bit versus someone who is completely agnostic to whatever. So yeah, I guess the short answer is yes. And, I understand that's definitely sort of a lever point there, a place to really educate and engage if we're going to see some change. So, yeah. Really good question. What's coming to mind for me, one is, if you're specifically kind of talking about reforming philanthropy or whatnot, what I'll say about that, two thoughts. One is when the book first came out, I did like 40 NPR interviews, and which were super interesting because I was talking to like Mary Sue from Dayton, Ohio, who calling in with a question, right? And I'm like, do they even know what philanthropy is? People did. I was really shocked that like regular folks in America are catching on, and this is why I say eventually they're going to come for these resources. Regular folks are catching on. In the last election with the Trump Foundation and Clinton Foundation, all the stuff that was in the news, that sparked something for regular folks to begin exploring philanthropy. And people were calling in from random places talking about the minimum payout rule. And I'm like, how do you know what that is? Like, because they used to be, So I think that this book is hitting a nerve with the public. But I'll be transparent and share sort of something I'm struggling with. As I've been invited to come into community groups, one, I don't think the burden should be on nonprofits and community groups to reform philanthropy, right? That power dynamic, when they are desperately needing resources, it's not fair to ask them to do that. I do tell a story in the book where a nonprofit did a direct action on the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, which I was like, yeah, I love the story. There are many times that I wish the community would just organize on philanthropy and just come for us. But I don't ask community groups to do that. I don't think it's fair to kind of, get people charged up to do that. So that's, but where I've struggled is trying to figure out what is the message that we want people to have. I think that we need movement folks, as I said earlier, need to understand money and how it's moving through the world. There's an awesome group called Transform Finance that brings organizers in, and like you get like an MBA in a week. They teach you about like, this is how money works, because it's really important for us to understand that. A lot of us in the movement don't come from families where you had a father to teach us about the stock market, you know, or whatnot. So that's just education that's really critical. So I just always say in community spaces, y'all need to learn about money, because that's what these issues are really about. And then, you know, secondly, how do we prepare our communities, especially communities of color, to receive, you know, what might be coming? Right? And so if I was successful with my message where I'm telling foundations, you need to take 10% of your corpus and turn it over to communities of color. We need to be, there's work to happen in community in terms of our orientation and how us being comfortable with money. Because we've been so oppressed and marginalized and redlined by philanthropy, I think we have work that we can do to support communities to be more comfortable in understanding this wealth belongs to us, and how do we transcend the competition and the scarcity mindsets and all of that. So there's work that we need to be doing, but there's work that needs to be done in community. And I don't know who might be doing that type of work or how we can support that work happening. I need to think about that some more, and I'd love to hear ideas if people have those. Really good point that you lifted up. I love to demystify philanthropy, because we're not all that, right? We are a small drop of money that's moving through the world, and most money, philanthropy and giving, is individuals giving. I have not really heard an example. I think that's where we need to be. There are a few groups, I mean, there's lots of groups, and you probably know some of them, who are really engaging community, you know, democratizing philanthropy. But my critique of some of that is often large foundations who are putting a little bit of money aside for like a special kind of program. And so there's really no robust program that I know of. There are larger foundations who I think are better at relationship building with community than others, who really do try to listen and shape their grant making strategies based off of what they're learning. There's a couple of investment firms that I've heard really good work about, like Aluminum Capital, who actually takes investors into the community to sit in a circle with folks who are doing work on the ground to inform their investments and whatnot. So building relationship and connection versus coming in as a savior and with a top-down approach. But it's really hard for philanthropy to get in that position. It's really hard for us just to listen. There's a whole chapter on listening that I wrote in the book, because that's the number one thing I hear from nonprofit folks is like, we just wish that funders would listen. And we are very challenged when it comes to listening, because we have the wealth and the power and we think we know best. And so we've got to get to a place to to undo that, to stop that, so that we can actually listen and maybe learn from community. But yeah, I wish I had more examples of folks who are really doing that. But I think that we will, I'm lifting that up. I'm lifting up the community knowledge and indigenous knowledge in meetings, and I think people are curious. But to give up your power to change something to the extent that it's going to cause you to have to take a back seat and not drive something is really hard for people to do who have had privilege. So one, I think that we all need to do this work to get to a place of racial healing in our country. But as it pertains to money, there are decision points that we can all make, whether you have $5 or $5 million, right? Where you spend that $5 matters, right? What businesses you choose, where you choose the bank matters. And so I often tell people that many of us, we may not be millionaires, but we're only a few degrees removed from being a millionaire. If you look at, I'm not a millionaire, but I have some retirement money that's in a larger, fund, right? So I have power over deciding where that little bit of money is invested. I get to vote on who's on the boards of these organizations, where my money is. If you have a pension fund, right, there are ways that you can push and organize around how that money is used. But yeah, if you don't, just an individual with $5, you can decide to go to a Black-owned business versus so however you can just think about using the money that you have to close the race wealth gap and to privilege those who historically have been marginalized, I think is powerful. I mean, I guess back to your point, Gary, about boards, I found out early on that's where a lot of the power does sit. As a young, naive, program officer at a foundation, bringing my portfolio of Black and Brown-led organizations there, I saw within our own board at the first job where I worked, all of the overlapping relationships and the networking of the good old boys there who were running, it was a health foundation, and so we had the head of the hospital association on our board. We had the heads of all these major health institutions there who were also being funded by the foundation, right? And so when I bring my little portfolio over and say, I want to stop funding Duke Medical Center and fund these, how people reacted to that and how it was shut down made it very clear to me, well, that's where power is sitting. Within the staff, I was like a champion and like, yeah, this is the right thing to do. So that's where I've learned. The other side of that, I've seen power. I've had the opportunity to work for the past year with an extremely wealthy woman that you would know the name if I said it. And this is a person who, if she made one tiny shift in her decision making, would have profound effects on where money was being invested. And so for me, just the power of actually building a relationship, the stuff that is kind of like intuitive, but if we do that work to build a relationship and to meet people where they are and to guide them on a journey, to bring them in versus push them out, I've seen hearts and minds change. And I've seen a place where a fund that had zero race analysis and was actually abrasive to it when I first started talking to them, now be super explicit and far along in their journey when it comes to funding that work in ways that when I forget to name it, they're saying, hey, what about this, And so I do think there's power in just really doing the work to bring people, meeting people where they are. People that hold wealth. I feel like a lot of those folks are good people who have not been educated, are not exposed, and are living in their bubble of privilege with blinders on. And if we can find a way to get to some of those folks, many of them might actually come around and be on our side and use their resources to support the work we care about. It takes a lot of grace. I think that I've been thinking about sort of like grace a lot lately because I think as a movement, just as people, need to have more space in our lives, more forgiveness, more love, especially in these times. And, I was, just thinking the other day, what if today was the day that somebody woke up, right? Like they were like, oh, I've been thinking about this all wrong. I want to do the right thing. Would we have a place for them in our circle? Would we have grace and a space for them to come and join? And I shared just a little random story that popped in my head just now. I don't know if this is the best example, but I was doing a conversation a few weeks ago with a foundation in New York. It's called the Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice, maybe a different combination of those words. And this is a very progressive fund that supports queer rights around the world. And I was on a panel, super, diverse room, and on the panel with folks. And I was, on this panel as someone who's like super progressive and thinking about this stuff, right? And the point that I made with this group is that probably 20 years ago, I would have believed that everyone in that room was going to hell. That's how far away I was from where I am now. And then probably only 6 years ago, I did not have an analysis around trans issues because I had never met a trans person. I moved from North Carolina to Seattle, met a trans person, and I was at this social event, and I wanted to learn in the most respectful way, and I asked someone a question. And in asking the question, I was like publicly humiliated for asking the question. Now, it wasn't even a crazy question. I know what's really appropriate to ask or not ask. And it was very painful because I was like, I thought we were on the same side. I'm trying to help. I want to be an ally. And so where are the spaces where we can ask questions and learn? And do we have the grace to invite people in who may say the wrong thing, may not quite be there? We often, who are the people who are enlightened, can be so critical of others who are not quite there yet. And so I'm asking all of us to try to find a place to have grace, to let others catch up. That's the only way that we're going to get there together. We may not agree on all 10 of the bullet points of the campaign, but if we agree on 3 things, can we start there, right? And so that is the real hard work and where the tension is and the struggle is in trying to find that common ground. But I also want to acknowledge that at times it is painful, as you said. Every day that I get up, I don't have the strength to go into an all-white space and do that work that day. Like some days I'm like, I can't do it today. The day I was at the Indigenous Peoples March when the incident happened where the young folks were mocking the elder, and I was on the train back to New York, and I was like, I can't even talk to a white person today, right? Like I had to just check out and just, And so there are times we have to do that self-care, do what you have to do to like pick up the energy to get back in, to have that grace for others. We cannot help others heal if we're not healed, if we're not doing the work. And unfortunately, I don't know any way out other than those of us who are enlightened, we're gonna have to do the pro bono work that we don't get paid to do to teach others. And the burden is often on people of color, on women of color, to be the teachers, to be the leaders, to help others get there. And I know that's exhausting, and there are power dynamics there at play. I see people taking one for the team and dealing with a lot of shit, often from being the person that has to call things out or whatnot. So I know that's really hard, but so I just, I don't know, my personal work is to try to have more grace and not to be quick to judge, to give people a pass and not feel like I have to correct them every single time they do something that is not exactly the right way or my way, and just say, you know what, they're gonna get there. Just try to find the love and really practice the value of all my relations. Like the power dynamic is different, the history is different, the skin color is different, they may have voted different, but if I can see this person as someone that is my relative and try to find some love, then I will at least be open to a place of having a conversation, and then they can feel that. They can feel that if I'm open and I'm not gonna judge, I'm not gonna tear down, and then they might be willing to come and sit down and actually be a lot more open. So that's my approach to this situation, and I find that it is working in a lot of cases, and people are inviting me in because they are not afraid that I'm going to judge them when I walk into the room. So. Yeah, by pro bono, I don't mean that we shouldn't be compensating people for this work. We absolutely should be paying people for their knowledge and their wisdom. And coming from an indigenous community that shares so open source, like I see it all the time. I mean, a lot of the practices that are out there, like restorative justice and whatnot, they all came out of indigenous communities. And so I think people should be compensated. By pro bono, I mean sort of the extra tax of things that are not a part of your job description, but you have to do every day at work because you are a person of color. You have to be the one to like educate or point something out because you can see the disparity in ways that other people don't see it. And you're probably not compensated for that. Should be, but often we're not. Reparations, oh God. I love the idea of reparations. What I'll just say real quickly about reparations, because it is a hot topic, the presidential candidates are all talking about it. I think there's a lot of work that we have to do, and philanthropy may have a role in supporting that. before we can get to a place of reparations. I think that reparations is far off because, like we were talking about earlier, we're not sorry. Reparations is a major act of like, I mean, you got to be sorry. You got to see what you did, and be. I mean, it's going to take major political will for that to happen in this country, and we're just not there when we're still living in denying that our history is what it is. So I think that truth and reconciliation process has to happen before something like reparations can be a reality in this country. But I hope I'm proven wrong. So I'm learning a lot about like Black-owned banks that exist in communities, and other POC-led economic development initiatives and institutions that are trying to build wealth. So there's a lot happening outside of traditional banking. One thing that we have to figure out, and maybe there's a role for progressive funders to support this, if we're going to create alternative products, they got to be good quality, right? And I'll share a story. I bank with credit unions, and credit unions are good, bad, ugly, the whole gamut. But when I moved to New York, I went to this very progressive bank to open an account because I'm like, I want to do the right thing. It was terrible service. The app didn't work. I would go in, they would, like, the hours were from like 10 to 3. Just all that stuff, right? And I got so tired of trying to just do my banking that I just quit banking there. I still have money there that I haven't even gone to get out because it would be, I haven't been available between 8 and 3 to go get it or whatever, right? And so one day I'll go get the rest of my money out. But, and I actually met the CEO of that bank and I gave him the feedback. If we are going to be competitive and want to offer a better way that is that has these values, we've got to have products that are just as good as the Wells Fargo of the world, right? So that's something for us to figure out, because I do want to support those types of tools. But there's a lot of good stuff happening with in different communities to build wealth that are kind of bypassing some of the banks. I can give you some, hook you up with some folks if you want to learn more about that.